I'm an Uber driver in the Atlanta area. It's a great place to be an Uber driver, and there's always someone who needs a ride somewhere. I spend 6 hours a day in college classes, another 8 sleeping, and the rest of my time shuttling people to and fro around the Atlanta area. I've been doing this for about 3 years, and in that time, I've seen it all. I've had drunken frat boys that threatened to kick my ass when I wouldn't give them a ride. I've had annoying, nagging passengers who've constantly made me want to pull my hair out. I've seen the occasional cheating spouse hoping not to get caught, the local celebrity on their way to an event, the online influencer who thinks they're way more important than their subscriber count would suggest, just to name a few. I've had my fair share of funny moments too. The man and his potential lover who met his wife on the sidewalk, the 2 ladies deciding to go get a drink after they had thoroughly screamed at him, never gets old. And I've also had some scary times. The lady with the neck wound who nearly bled out in the back of my car after her boyfriend just pushed her in and ran off came to mind, for certain. Despite all my experience, though, this story definitely falls under the weird category. Well, I guess we can upgrade it into the scary category, all told. Any night where I almost lose my life can definitely be called scary. This happened in October, about a week before Halloween. My girlfriend and I live in a duplex near campus. I've lived there for about 4 years, and she's lived there for about 6 months. We were taking a semester off since none of the classes we needed were available in the fall, and on the night in question, I was hurrying to get ready so I could drop her off at the airport before I started working. She was going on a weekend trip to see her parents in Virginia, and I'd have the house to myself all weekend. I was a little skeptical about her destination, but I decided to let her dig her own grave if my suspicions were correct. Maybe it was all the extra time I was spending at home, but I'd started to notice that something was a little off about her lately. She'd been fired from her job recently, and though she kept saying she was going to get another one, I didn't see her making any effort to do so. All she seemed to do was talk to people on Discord. She'd gotten really into this local group, spooky stuff from what I'd seen, and she was constantly chatting and texting with them. I was suspicious, but I wasn't really worried. At that point, I figured the worst she could do was dump me. We chatted on the way to the airport, talking about what she'd do once she got there, and how much she would miss me. She bemoaned how bored she would be at her parents' house, and when we arrived at the airport, she kissed me goodbye and headed into the busy terminal. As she left for her parents' house, or wherever she was going, I decided to get some work in, since I was at the airport anyway. I pulled into the temporary parking area and signed into the Uber app. The airport was usually an excellent place to find fares, and sure enough, someone was trying to get a lift. He wanted to go to a hotel nearby, and after agreeing to the ride, I moved back into the concourse to pick him up. He was a big dude, around 6 feet and muscular. He had a bag, which he put in my trunk, and a smaller bag, which he kept on his lap. I asked him where he was going, and he verified the address, so off we went. He was pretty quiet the whole way there. He looked cramped in my back seat, like a sardine in a can, but he took it well. Mostly he just played on his phone, typing away to someone as we rode in silence. That wasn't uncommon, and I honestly preferred clients who weren't chatterboxes. There was nothing worse than trying to hear your GPS over some drunk backseat DJ who wants the aux cord, or some tourist who wants a guided tour of the city as you dodge rush hour traffic. We drove for about 20 minutes before pulling up outside the hotel without much fuss. I told the guy we'd arrived, and he quickly slipped the phone into his carry-on and offered to tip me for arriving so quickly. I said it wasn't necessary, since that sort of thing was usually handled through the app, but he went ahead and slipped a 20 up next to my headrest, and I took it with thanks. Rules or not, money is money. He asked if I'd pop the trunk, and when he had his suitcase, he thanked me and walked towards the front of the building. I was getting ready to check the app for fares in the area when I heard a noise from the back seat. It was that high-pitched ding noise that so many phones use for notifications, and when I looked in the back seat, I realized the guy had forgotten his carry-on. It had slipped into the floorboard, and I could see the black light on his cell phone through the mesh. I dug out the phone and started to reach for the door when my eyes registered what the message on the lock screen had said. A picture of a pretty blonde was next to the message, and she was asking if he'd gotten to the hotel yet. Another popped up to say that she was running a little late, but she'd be there in 5. She couldn't wait to meet everyone, and she was so glad that she had finally done this. And it was about time they all got together, and the picture was of my girlfriend. I just stared at the phone for a few minutes before someone honked at me and I drove into a parking spot. A cab had just pulled up behind me, and as I parked, I couldn't help but notice when my girlfriend stepped out and walked to the hotel. She still had her suitcase, her furry boots, her parka, the leggings that she had left the house in, and she smiled hugely as she looked at the hotel. She clearly hadn't seen me, which was good because I had about 1,000 questions I would have likely bombarded her with. She was supposed to be on a flight to Virginia, but instead, it looked like she was meeting some random guy from Discord. Was she cheating? Cheating seemed to be the most obvious answer, but why? We'd never had any problems. Our relationship had been smooth since the beginning. Why now was she... The phone dinged as another message popped up, but this one was from a different guy. "How many have arrived?" he asked. My girlfriend responded, "5, Master. Damien seems to have lost his phone, but he's here too." I had meant to check for fares in the area, but instead I found myself watching the phone as the messages rolled in. I was in full information gathering mode now, and anything I could come back with would help me in the long run. If this was a misunderstanding or something, I wanted to know before I melted down on my girlfriend. As it stood, though, it was beginning to look very sketchy. I couldn't open the phone, of course. It was one of those fingerprint lock ones that wouldn't open without a password or a fingerprint, and since I knew neither, all I could do was watch the dialog boxes come up. The boxes only stayed for a couple of seconds, and often the messages were too long for the boxes to contain the whole thing, so I was forced to read a little at a time. What I read made me think my initial suspicions might be off. At first, it looked like she was meeting people at a hotel for an unspecified event. As I waited, I saw other people approach, their faces matching the images on the app. I was pretty sure that these people were the ones she was waiting for, because their arrival at the desk was followed by confirmation that someone else had arrived. After 8 or 9 of them had gone up, they began talking to the mysterious Master. The more they talked, the more I realized that this wasn't a weird sex thing. The group started talking about the Ascension and the altar site, to which he responded that they would learn more tonight. He asked my girlfriend if the sacrifice was ready, and she informed him that it would be there when the time came. He quoted some verses that sounded pseudo-biblical and referred to them as the Coven several times. The more I read, the more I began to believe that she might be part of a cult instead. I sat outside the hotel for several hours, and as it got dark, he told them that the preparations were taking longer than expected. He told them they should meet him at the altar site and sent directions, which I got about half of. He told them to be there before dark, and like a flock of birds, they came from the hotel and moved towards cars parked in the parking lot. I ducked down, not wanting to be seen, and I watched as she got into a late-model black sedan. The sedan drove away in a convoy of other vehicles, and since I didn't have all the directions, I cranked my car and followed them. As they moved out of town and got onto the highway, I tried not to make it obvious that I was tailing them. The freeway was busy. It's close enough to end-of-day traffic that I can hide in a crowd, but as we left the interstate, it became harder to blend in. As the sun sank, I saw the turnoff for the access road, their cars kicking up dust as they rumbled down the gravel road. I didn't want to lose them, wherever they were going, so I pulled off the road for a few minutes before following. It turned out they were heading for Panola State Park. As I drove down the bumpy outlet road, the sun started to set for real. The trees started leaning in on me like hands in a funhouse, and the road was so narrow that if someone decided to leave, I'd be in for some trouble. The darkness had swallowed my car before I reached the end, and all at once, my headlights created beacons of light in the encroaching blackness. The park was beautiful during the day, but in the late night shadows, it had a spooky look to it that only wooded areas in fall can pull off. I suddenly had Blair Witch flashbacks as I trumbled through the spooky backdrop. My girlfriend was definitely into some weird stuff here, weirder than even my imagination could have conjured up, and I knew that I needed to get her out of there before things got bad. When I reached the end of the outlet road, I found a dark parking lot with several cars in it. It must have been a campground at one point or another. I could see a bathroom and a picnic area off the parking lot, and the lot was flanked with lights that no longer seemed to work. I turned off my lights and got out of my car, but when no one immediately came out to get me, I figured they had moved on. I snuck around the building, and sure enough, they were bathrooms. One was a men's room, and one was a women's room. Both were unlocked, but the doors had that broken-into look. Someone had set up a couple of tents in the shadowy space between the building and the forest, but so far I'd seen no one. As I took a step towards the tents, however, a bright light sprang up to my left, and I saw a large bonfire crackling in the woods. It was off to the side of the campground, and for a moment, the sudden flash left me glare-blind. When hands caught me under my arms and dragged me forward, I was momentarily unable to fight back. By the time my eyes adjusted to the sudden flare of the lights, I was already close enough to feel the bonfire's heat and hear the chanting of those around it. It had been low at first, but now it had reached a fever pitch as they drew me closer to the fire. I struggled, but the two men who had me were much bigger than I was. I was pretty sure that one of them was the fare I'd had earlier, and we came up just short of walking into the fire. A robed man in a lacquered mask stepped up and raised his hand for silence, the chanting tapering off as they turned towards me. We stood in silence for 30 seconds before the masked man spoke. Unlike the muscle-bound guys holding me, the guy was not on speaking terms with physical exercise. His robes bulged in front, and had I not been suspended between two men, he would have still been a head shorter than me. When he spoke, though, it was apparent that he had power here. This one must be Master. As I told you, as Sister Serenity said, the sacrifice has arrived. Another robed figure moved away from the group and stood beside the fat robed man. She was about my height and had shoulder-length blonde hair. When I met her gaze, I realized it was my girlfriend. I wondered why I didn't recognize her at first, but it became apparent almost immediately. In the firelight, her hair was a frizzy mess as opposed to the straight and silky curtain she almost always kept it in. She looked almost feral as she stared at me, and I didn't see any of her usual warmth there. All of her love or happiness was gone, and she looked at me as though I were meat, like I was something that would bring her joy once I was cooked black and offered on a plate. I was put on my knees before her, and the fat man handed her a silver knife that he drew out of a scabbard like a magic trick. She looked at the knife like she'd never seen one before, and as she returned to reality, she approached me with the blade. I finally realized what I should have seen from the beginning. I was the sacrifice. He'd left the phone in my car on purpose, and even though there was no way she could have known that he'd get in my car, somehow she had. She'd meant for me to be here, for me to be her sacrifice. And as she raised the knife, I had to know why. "Why did you do this? I thought you loved me," I said, sounding pathetic, but still dying to know what this was all about. She looked at me, surprised, before saying, "Because it's why I got with you in the first place. There's always a sacrifice before the coming of winter. The Green Man requires a gift, and it was my turn this year. I had to have someone to give to the fire, and you were there to fill the role." And with that, she raised the knife, and I closed my eyes as I prepared for the strike. When the bullhorn sounded, it scared me just as much as it scared them. "Drop the knife and put your hands in the air. You're all under arrest for—" "Hey, don't move or we'll—" But it was too late. The knife clattered to the ground next to my head, and they all scattered like quail. I was dumped, face first to the ground, unceremoniously, as my two captors beat feet for the woods. The sounds of shouts and boots and the occasional gunshot surrounded me, and I lay still as I hoped not to be shot out of hand. Eventually, a pair of boots came into my peripheral vision, and my hands were jerked back into flex cuffs as I was lifted up so the officers could have a look at me. A half hour later, and I'm in a detective's office with a warm cup of coffee and a recently freed wrist. We've been tracking these guys for years. They come to Atlanta the most often of any of their other haunts, and it leads me to believe that most of them are from here. About once every 3 years, we find a body at the state park. They take their organs, scribble some runes on the Vic, and just leave them there. Usually the animals have found them before we do. You're actually the first victim we've managed to find alive. It's a wonder we found you in time." He told me a lot of things that evening. He told me that this Green Man they all worship, some Eastern European god or something, and how they believe that if they don't make a sacrifice, he'll bring terrible fury down upon them. They always make a sacrifice right before Halloween, and it's always some random person they've probably known for less than a year. I gave him my girlfriend's name and the name of the guy from the airport, but he told me neither one checked out. Both were likely fake names, used to cover their tracks. Despite messaging my girlfriend, all I've received is a notice that the number has been canceled. So that's where I stand now. I'm afraid to go home because she has a house key. I'm afraid to go to my parents' house because she's met them. I don't know who to talk to, where to turn, or how many of our friends are involved in this little cult too. The detective told me to be very careful after all, because while they didn't catch my girlfriend, they did catch somebody. He took me to a little room with a one-way mirror in it and had me identify a pudgy guy in a robe. He was talking to another detective in a very animated way, the man staying calm despite the amount of flailing he was doing. He asked if this was the guy that my girlfriend had been talking to, the one they called Master, and I nodded. The man suddenly leaned forward and yelled at the detective, who sat back quickly despite the man's hands being chained to the table. Spit flew from his mouth as he yelled. Even through the glass, I could hear what he was screaming. "You don't get it. You idiots just don't get it. We aren't worshiping the Green Man. We're all here to protect you from him. If this false sacrifice isn't received, then he will come. He'll come and he will kill. You have to release me. The sacrifice must be completed." That was about the time 2 other officers ran in and restrained him, but his message was clear enough. If anyone reading this has any information, I'd suggest you go to the police. These Green Man guys will have to strike again soon. If they believe that their actions keep us safe, if their delusion is something that must be accomplished, then any one of you may be in danger. I was groomed for 6 months, kept safe like a pig for the slaughter, but they don't have time to be so choosy anymore. The Green Man must be appeased, and soon, lest we suffer his wrath. Who knows which one of you might find yourself beside the fire this year. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you enjoyed tonight's story and you haven't already, why not go ahead and subscribe? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. While you're here, maybe go ahead and give that video a like and drop a comment. I like it when people comment. If you're not too spooked and you think you might can handle a little more, why not go ahead and click on one of those other videos that's about to pop up? Maybe check out one of our playlists. There's quite a few. If you'd like to support the channel more monetarily, I'd suggest maybe you go pick up a copy of my latest book. There's a link below. Or maybe head on over to Patreon. I have quite a few tiers. I'm sure there's one that'll suit you best. Speaking of Patreon, let's go ahead and thank our patrons, shall we? Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. And thanks to Winters, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Martha, Marianne Schuler, Jennifer Damron, and Tyler Parker for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you're a fan of my books, I always recommend go ahead and join that Ghostly Reader tier. $10 a month, and it also gets you a book anytime I write one, which is around twice a year usually. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.